Expensive tea usually costs more for a reason. There are many reasons why expensive tea is better than cheap tea, and we're going to cover a few of them in this video. By learning about these differences, you will also learn how to not overpay for tea. Cheap teas can be sold as expensive teas without actually being better. Before we get started, it would really mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay tuned for future tea videos. We have hundreds of tea videos on all sorts of topics related to Japanese green tea, but for this episode, we're going to focus on cheap versus expensive tea specifically. If you'd prefer to read about this topic, you can find the link to the blog in the description below. Without further ado, let's get started. The number one difference between cheap and expensive tea is leaf quality. Of course, the more expensive tea leaves will be used to make more expensive teas. Not all leaves on the tea plant are created equal, and the youngest sprouts on top of the tea plant are the most sought after. These younger sprouts on the tea plant have a higher nutrient profile, and they tend to have a smoother and sweeter taste. When you look at the most expensive tea in Japan, gyokuro and matcha, they're all made from the youngest leaves. Cheap tea like bancha and genmaicha is made from the older leaves of the tea plant. While these leaves are less desirable, some people like the milder taste and the lower caffeine content. Difference number two, appearance. You can also tell the difference between expensive tea and cheap tea by looking at the appearance of the leaves. For the most expensive tea in Japan, gyokuro, you want to look for large, unbroken needles and a darker color. This indicates that the leaves have a high theanine content and that they were carefully processed. While these large needles are something to look for in a gyokuro and a kabuse sencha, they are not something you will find in fukumushi sencha or deep steam tea. This tea is steamed for a longer time, and during that longer steaming process, the tea leaves become more brittle and easier to break. These smaller leaf particles infuse quickly into the water and create a rich green infusion. In other teas, these small leaf particles would be a negative indicator, but with fukumushi tea, it's just something that comes along with the tea. Number three, flavor. Of course, flavor is mostly subjective, but there are some aspects of expensive teas that make the flavor objectively better than cheap teas. The first is the complexity of the flavor. With most tea bag teas, you will find that the flavor of the tea is very flat. This means that the flavor really only goes in one direction. With premium loose leaf tea, you get a complex assortment of different flavors, all being experienced at different times. This leads to a richer tasting experience, and is the reason why these teas are more desirable. The complex flavor of these teas can only be created by nuance in the growing and production process. If these steps are skipped, you will end up with a cheap tea and a flat flavor. The second aspect when it comes to the flavor is bitterness. While a subtle bitterness can be an enjoyable taste in a green tea, it can very easily be overdone. Expensive teas tend to either have no bitterness at all, or just enough to challenge the palate without overpowering the other flavors. With cheap teas, on the other hand, you tend to only experience the bitterness, with no other discernible taste characteristics in the tea. Number four is color. Expensive tea doesn't have one specific color palette that it follows, but there are different colors you should be looking for. As a general rule, high-quality green tea should be somewhere on the spectrum from bright yellow to dark green, but never orange or brown. When the liqueur of the brewed green tea is orange or brown, that is usually indicative of a cheap tea. Tea that is dark green is not necessarily superior to tea that is yellowish. The color of the brewed tea depends on many different factors. For example, gyokuro is a more expensive tea, but the color is yellow, whereas the color of fukumushi sencha is much greener. In this case, it has to do with the steaming process. When you steam the leaves for longer, they take on more of a vibrant green color, and more of it is released into the water. When it comes to matcha, one of the most expensive teas in Japan, you really need to find a powder that has a bright green color. A greener color doesn't always mean a better matcha, but the steps that are taken during the production process of high-quality matcha yield both a smoother flavor as well as a greener color. When these steps are skipped to create a cheap tea, it's likely that you will have a very bitter matcha and a dull green or brown color. Number five, price. It's a given that expensive teas will cost more than cheap teas, but how much more? When we are talking about matcha, for example, high-quality matcha should cost between $1 and $2 per gram. If it's sold for significantly less than that, it's usually the case that it's lower quality. The big exception is the Noike matcha, a super smooth okumidori matcha made by Mr. Noike outside of Kyoto. This tea has a flavor that rivals teas double its price. When it comes to leaf teas, you should be looking somewhere in between the price range of 20 cents per gram to 45 cents per gram. With gyokuro, the most expensive tea in Japan other than matcha, you can expect to pay between 30 cents per gram and $1 per gram. The gyokuro cha musumi is a great value here. Because of Mr. Sakamoto's careful production process, this tea picks up a rich and sweet flavor, but you can get it for a much lower price compared to other gyokuro teas. Number six, brewing. If you compare all the cheap tea and all the expensive tea, there's one common theme you will notice. Cheap tea is almost always sold in tea bags, and expensive tea is almost always sold in loose leaf form. There is a reason for this, and it's the same reason why when you buy expensive tea in a tea bag, you are most likely overpaying. This is because the expensive tea leaves are almost always reserved for loose leaf teas. If a tea company wants to make a large quantity of cheap tea, they will attempt to buy as much leaf material as possible for as low of a price as possible. The customers of this mass-produced tea will likely want the tea to be instantly prepared and cheap. These constraints don't allow the company to purchase the most desirable leaf material, so they'll almost always purchase the leaf material that can't be used for premium teas, as this will be the cheapest. The tea will then have to be put into a bag so it can be quickly prepared without the proper teaware. During this process, the leaves have to be ground down into a tea dust so they can fit into the bag. This is also done to make the tea infuse faster. The tea bag itself will negatively impact the flavor of a tea. As a result, the expensive tea leaves are reserved for loose leaf tea to avoid being ruined by the tea bag. Even if a company were to use these expensive tea leaves in a tea bag, the flavor wouldn't match that of premium loose leaf tea. Now let's talk a little bit about loose leaf tea. Small farms often have a specific taste profile in mind when they are producing an expensive tea. They carefully grow the plant, process the leaves, and then blend the tea to capture just the right amount of sweetness, bitterness, and savoriness. These small batch teas are consumed in loose leaf form, with only a few kilos being produced for each particular kind. When cheap tea is mass produced in tea bags or in bottled tea, this nuance is lost. The producer of these mass market teas values consistency and low price, and this cannot be achieved on the individual farm level. When you go for loose leaf tea, you also get much more variety as well, and you can try some teas produced on each individual farm, rather than relying on a predetermined assortment from a handful of companies. Number 7, we have nutrients. In addition to having a richer taste, expensive tea often contains more nutrients. A lot of people that consume cheap tea do so for the health benefits of green tea, but they may be missing out. As mentioned before, the more expensive tea in Japan is made from the youngest sprouts of the tea plant. It's also made from the first harvest in the early springtime. During the winter, the tea plant is left alone to rest and also absorb nutrients from the soil. These nutrients are then released into the fresh sprouts at the springtime. Expensive teas like gyokuro, matcha, and shincha are made from these younger sprouts. Not only is the flavor of these superior, but the nutrient profile is as well. These younger sprouts also contain more caffeine as well. Caffeine is produced by the tea plant as a defense mechanism to protect it from insects. The younger leaves are more tender and vulnerable, so they produce more caffeine. As a result, expensive tea like gyokuro and matcha tends to have more caffeine than cheap tea like bancha and genmaicha. Number 8, we have cultivation. The final difference between cheap tea and expensive tea is the cultivation. When you are selecting teas, see if you can find information about how the tea is cultivated, as it will tell you a lot about the tea itself. As a basic rule, the more general name you have for a tea, the lower quality it tends to be. If it's simply sold as green tea, it's a good chance that it's made from the cheapest green tea leaves available. If the tea is known as Shincha Asanoka Kabuse Sencha, you can tell that the tea is first harvest, Shincha, it comes from the Asanoka cultivar, and it's shaded for a long time before the harvest. These small details about the production process show you that a lot of care was taken in order to achieve a very specific flavor profile. The cultivar or variety of the tea plant should be clearly stated. This is similar to varietals in the wine world. If a wine is simply sold as red wine, it's likely that the quality is very low. Don't overpay for cheap tea or expensive tea. It is important to bring up the fact that expensive teas can be overpriced. We use the word expensive tea for convenience, but what we're really referring to is premium tea or high quality tea. Of course, if low quality tea is sold for a high price, it can be considered expensive tea. To avoid overpaying for tea, it's important that you go through this list of factors and ask why the tea is expensive. If it doesn't meet some or most of this criteria, it is likely overpriced. We hope you found this list helpful when it comes to buying tea. We would really appreciate it if you could support our mission by going to neoteas.com and trying some green tea for yourself. We have dozens of different types of great green teas that we source from small farmers in Japan. All of these farmers produce their teas without the use of pesticides or chemicals, and after trying hundreds of different teas, these are the ones that we've settled on as the best tasting. It would also mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video to see more like it in the future. If you have any questions about tea, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Until then, we'll see you next time.